This love is going to make you look back at every heartbreak, every confusing ending, every person who made you question yourself and go, "Oh, okay. Now I understand why that could never have been my forever." And listen, I'm not saying what happened to you was good. I'm saying the contrast is going to be so strong that suddenly you'll understand what you were being prepared to recognize. Because the first card here is the moon. And the moon, psychologically, is about what happens when you're trying to find your way through something you cannot fully see yet. Confusion, projection, fear. Filling in blanks because somebody refuses to give you clarity. And some of you have had relationships exactly like that. You weren't dating the person. You were dating potential. You weren't receiving consistency. You were interpreting mixed signals. You weren't being reassured. You were lying awake thinking, maybe they're just scared. Maybe they need more time. Maybe if I love them harder, they'll finally understand what we could be. Okay. But here's where this gets interesting. The love I'm talking about is going to expose just how exhausting that old version of love actually was. Because this person does not make you decode them. And for some of you, that is going to feel weird at first. Like, genuinely weird. You may catch yourself waiting for the switch up. Waiting for the text to get colder. Waiting for the energy to change after a really good date. Waiting for that familiar moment where somebody pulls away the second you start feeling safe. But they don't. And that's when something inside you starts changing. Now, I also feel like, for some of you, this person is already around you, but you haven't categorized them as the one, or even as somebody you would seriously date yet. They could be a friend, an acquaintance, somebody you see through work, someone you recently started talking to, or somebody whose presence feels unusually calm. And pay attention to that word, calm. Because your past may have trained you to confuse anxiety with chemistry. This person is going to teach you something completely different. But the biggest reason they're going to make your heartbreak finally make sense has nothing to do with attraction. It has to do with realizing you no longer have to earn love. And that's where the next card takes this reading. And interestingly, what comes out here is the Ace of Wands reversed. And I actually really like this after the moon. Because psychologically, this tells me some of you have spent way too much time trying to create momentum in relationships that were not naturally moving. You were the spark. You were the encouragement. You were the person keeping the conversation alive, making the plans, giving second chances, explaining why their behavior probably wasn't as bad as it looked. You kept trying to restart something that kept going cold. And eventually, without even realizing it, love became something you performed. You became extra understanding, extra patient, extra flexible. You told yourself, I don't want to pressure them. I don't want to ask for too much. I can handle it. And some of you became so good at being low maintenance that nobody ever had to learn how to actually show up for you. That's the part I really want you to hear. Because there is a difference between loving somebody and constantly making yourself easier to love. And I think you learned that difference the hard way. Maybe somebody gave you one good night, one vulnerable conversation, 1 week where everything finally felt right, and you survived emotionally on that for another 3 months. Because you thought, see, it's in there. They can do it. So you kept working for the next version of that moment. But this person? You're not going to have to keep restarting the fire. And there may actually be a moment where you catch yourself doing it anyway. Maybe they haven't texted for a few hours because they're busy, and immediately you start thinking, okay, let me send something funny. Let me make sure the energy is still good. And before you even do it, they text you. Not because you pulled them back, not because you reminded them you exist. They just wanted to talk to you. And that sounds so small. But for somebody who has spent years trying to maintain other people's interest, that can hit you in a surprisingly emotional way. Because suddenly you realize, oh, I don't have to keep this alive by myself. That is what changes everything. The heartbreak wasn't exhausting only because somebody left. It was exhausting because, for so long, you were auditioning for a permanent place in somebody's life. Trying to be lovable enough, useful enough, patient enough, easy enough. And this connection starts removing the audition entirely, which sounds beautiful. And it is. But here's the strange part. Some of you are going to discover that being loved without performing for it is actually harder to receive than you expected. Because look at what comes out next. The Elder of Wands reversed. And this is actually such an interesting card here. Because reversed, I see this as questioning the kind of intensity you used to automatically trust. Like, if nobody is making you nervous, are you even attracted to them? If you're not checking your phone every 10 minutes, does it mean you don't care? If you can go home after seeing this person and just have a normal evening instead of replaying every sentence they said, was there even chemistry? And this is where you have to be careful. Because some of you were trained by inconsistency to experience relief as romance. Think about it. Somebody disappears emotionally for 3 days. You're anxious. You're wondering what changed. You're looking at their last message thinking, did I say something wrong? And then suddenly they come back warm again. And that rush you feel, that huge, emotional, oh my God, okay, we're good feeling? You may have called that chemistry. But part of what you were feeling was relief. The anxiety stopped, temporarily. And when that happens over and over again, the emotional highs can become so intense that a steady person almost feels confusing. Because there's no dramatic comeback. They never disappeared. There's no amazing text after 2 days of silence. They were already talking to you. No guessing, no chasing, no emotional hangover. And you might actually sit there at some point and think, wait, do I even like them enough? Meanwhile, you're relaxed around them. You trust what they say. You're not analyzing whether they secretly lost interest because they used a period instead of an exclamation point. You're sleeping. But because your nervous system isn't doing backflips, part of you may wonder where the spark is. And that's what I think this Elder of Wands reversed is challenging. Your old measurement system. Because intensity is not automatically intimacy, and uncertainty is not automatically passion. Sometimes anxiety makes somebody feel incredibly important simply because your brain cannot stop trying to solve them. This person doesn't give you a puzzle. So at first, your mind may not know what to do with all that extra space. And yes, peace can feel boring before it starts feeling safe. But there is going to be one moment with this person where that confusion ends. One very ordinary moment. And when it happens, you're going to realize, oh, this is completely different from everything I've known before. And the card that comes out for that moment is the Star reversed. Which is interesting, because the Star reversed can speak to what happens when hope has been disappointed enough times that you stop trusting good things while they're happening. So imagine this. Something bothers you. Not something huge. Maybe they say something that lands wrong. Maybe plans change and it hits an old nerve. Maybe you're having a rough day and you need a little more reassurance than usual. And immediately, part of you starts preparing. You're thinking, okay, how do I say this without sounding needy? How do I bring this up without ruining the mood? Should I just let it go? Because some of you learned that expressing a completely normal need could change the entire temperature of a relationship. You say, hey, that hurt my feelings. And suddenly they're cold. You ask for clarity. Now you're too much. You want reassurance. Now somehow you're the problem. So with this person, you may start doing that same calculation. And eventually you say it. Maybe even awkwardly. Maybe you over-explain. Maybe you end it with, it's fine though. I don't want this to become a whole thing. And they look at you and go, no, it's okay. Tell me, that's it. No punishment. No dramatic sigh. No disappearing for 6 hours so you can wonder whether you destroyed everything. They listen. Maybe they explain what they meant. Maybe they apologize. Maybe they even disagree with part of what you're saying. Because again, this person is not perfect, but they stay in the conversation. And I think that is going to do something to you. Because you're going to walk away from that interaction almost waiting for the consequence. You'll check your phone later expecting the energy to feel different. And it doesn't. They still text you normally. They still care. The relationship survived you having a feeling, and some of you are going to realize how wild it is that this feels revolutionary. The star reversed here says you may have gotten so used to protecting yourself from disappointment that simple emotional safety feels almost unbelievable. You weren't asking for too much. You were asking people who experienced your needs as an inconvenience. And when somebody finally shows you that honesty does not automatically lead to abandonment, that's when the past starts looking different. Not because you suddenly want those people back. Actually, the opposite. You may start grieving how many times you swallowed what you needed just to keep somebody who was already halfway out the door. And this is where the Three of Pentacles becomes really important. Because this card is about building something together. Not one person carrying the emotional weight while the other person occasionally participates together. And I think that contrast is going to bring up some feelings you weren't expecting. Because when somebody actually meets you halfway, you may suddenly remember all the times you were grateful for things that should have been normal. You might literally catch yourself thinking, wait, I used to thank somebody for calling me back, or I really thought asking for one phone call was needy. Or maybe you look back and realize you called somebody complicated for 2 years because admitting they simply were not prioritizing you would have hurt too much. And listen, this is not about judging the version of you who stayed. That version of you was working with what they understood at the time. But contrast changes things. Distance can help you get over somebody. Contrast helps you understand them. And there is a difference. Because this new person may do something incredibly basic, like make a plan with you and actually follow through. And instead of just enjoying it, you suddenly remember somebody who made you feel unreasonable for wanting that exact same thing. That's where grief can sneak in. Not grief because you want the old person back. Grief because you remember yourself back then, trying so hard, negotiating with your own needs, saying, "It's okay, I understand," when actually, you were hurt. Lowering the standard one little piece at a time because losing the relationship felt scarier than losing yourself inside it. And the Three of Pentacles says this connection teaches you what partnership actually feels like. You contribute. They contribute. You communicate. They communicate. You care about what works for them. And they care about what works for you. Nobody is keeping score because nobody is doing everything. And that may be the first moment where your heartbreak really starts making sense. Not because you were supposed to suffer. Not because every painful ending was secretly some perfect gift. But because now you finally have a comparison. Now you can see what love was not. You can see why those relationships required so much explaining, so much waiting, so much shrinking. And here's where this gets even bigger. Because once you experience a relationship where you don't have to abandon yourself to keep the connection, you may realize you don't even want to be the same person in love anymore. And the Eight of Swords coming out here makes so much sense. Because this card, psychologically, is what happens when you've been in survival mode for so long that even after the situation changes.
Your mind keeps looking for the trap.
And some of you are going to notice something strange in this relationship. You have more energy. You sleep better. You're not checking your phone every 5 minutes trying to figure out whether somebody's mood changed. You're not sitting at work rereading a text and asking 3 friends, What do you think they meant by this? You start getting your focus back, your humor comes back, your hobbies come back. You might even notice that you're more playful with this person because you're not constantly editing yourself. You just say the thing. You send the stupid meme. You laugh too loud. You stop rehearsing every message before you hit send. And at some point, you may realize, wow, I forgot I was like this. That matters. Because some of your past relationships took up an enormous amount of mental space. Not because they were deeply fulfilling, because they were unresolved. There was always something to analyze, something to fix, something to wait for, something to interpret. It became a full-time emotional investigation, and this person doesn't require that from you. Which means the relationship can actually be important without becoming your entire personality. You can love somebody and still have a life. You can miss them without panicking. You can spend a day focused on yourself without wondering whether the connection is disappearing. And honestly, one of the strongest signs that this is different may be how little mental bandwidth you have to spend proving that it's secure. But the Eight of Swords also shows me where this can get tricky. Because when you're used to being mentally occupied by love, all that freedom can feel unfamiliar, and your brain may start trying to fill the silence. You might suddenly notice flaws you didn't care about before. You might think, maybe something is missing, or feel an urge to pull back right when things are getting good. Not because this person did anything wrong, but because safety gives you nowhere to hide from your own fear. And that old survival habit, looking for danger before danger can find you. That is the one thing some of you may accidentally bring into this connection. And if you don't recognize it, you could mistake the feeling of finally being safe for a reason to run. And that's why the Emperor coming out here is so important. Because psychologically, the Emperor is about structure, stability, knowing where you stand. And weirdly enough, that can be terrifying when you're used to relationships where you never really knew what was happening. Because chaos gives you something to do. You can analyze it, you can chase it, you can try to fix it. But stability asks you to stop managing the relationship and actually experience it. And some of you may not realize how vulnerable that feels until you're in it. So maybe you have an amazing night with this person. Everything feels easy. They're affectionate, they're present. You leave feeling genuinely happy. And then the next morning, you pull back, just a little. Maybe you take longer to respond. Maybe you suddenly start thinking about some tiny thing they did and turn it into a much bigger problem. They said they want to travel someday. What if they never want to settle down? They're really close with their family. What if that becomes an issue? Or maybe you compare them to somebody from your past and think, I don't feel that insane chemistry I felt with my ex. Right, because your ex had you emotionally preparing for impact every other week. That intensity had a price. And the Emperor is showing something completely different. Predictability. Not control, not rigidity. Just the feeling that this person's behavior actually has a pattern you can trust. And here's where some of you may test that without realizing it. You might become distant just to see if they notice. You might say, it's fine, when it isn't, and secretly wait to see whether they chase the truth out of you. You might start expecting betrayal before there is any actual evidence of betrayal. Because if you find the problem first, maybe it can't surprise you later. And listen, not every feeling telling you to leave is automatically your deepest wisdom. Sometimes your fear recognizes unfamiliar safety and labels it danger because danger is what it knows how to survive. That doesn't mean ignore red flags. It means learn the difference between a red flag and an old alarm going off in a new room. Because with chaotic people, you are always preparing to lose them. But this person? You may actually start believing they could stay. And that creates a completely different fear. Now there's something real to lose. And I think there is going to be a point where that fear shows up visibly. You pull back, you get guarded. Maybe you expect them to react the way everybody else did. And what they do next, that is going to tell you everything. And then the sun comes out, which is such a strong card here, because the sun is clarity, nothing hidden, nothing being managed behind the scenes, nothing you have to decode. So when you pull back, this person does not suddenly become cruel. They don't punish you with silence. They don't flood your phone trying to force you back into closeness either. They just address it. Maybe they say, "Hey, you seem a little distant. If something's wrong, I'd rather you tell me." And some of you are going to freeze for a second, because you're expecting the rest of the sentence. The accusation, the guilt trip. The "after everything I've done for you," but it doesn't come. Instead, they might say something like, "I care about you." But I don't want us guessing what the other person is thinking. If you need space, tell me. If something bothered you, tell me that too, and notice something. That is not somebody begging you to stay. It is also not somebody threatening to leave. It is clarity, warmth with self-respect. And this matters because secure love does not mean somebody tolerates every defense mechanism you have just because they understand where it came from. It means the relationship is safe enough for both people to be honest. "I got scared," they can say. "I understand, but shutting me out doesn't work for me." And somehow, the relationship does not explode. Nobody has to win. Nobody disappears. Nobody turns the conversation into evidence that you're incompatible. You talk, you adjust, you move forward, and for some of you, this may be the first time a disagreement actually makes you feel more secure afterward. Because now you know something you didn't know before. This person can handle an uncomfortable conversation. You can disappoint each other without destroying each other. You can misunderstand something and repair it. And suddenly, love stops feeling like this fragile object you have to carry perfectly, or it shatters. The sun is exposing something the moon could never give you. Proof, not promises. Proof through behavior. And that is when the heartbreak starts making sense on an even deeper level. Because once you experience somebody who can meet you in honesty, accountability, affection, and boundaries, you start realizing something about the people who could never meet you there. And that realization, that may be the part that changes your entire understanding of your past. And then the Tower comes out. And honestly, this is the card that breaks the whole thing open. Because the Tower is what happens when an old understanding cannot survive new information. And that is exactly what this relationship is going to do to some of your old explanations. The ones you used to protect people. They cared. They were just scared. They loved me. They just didn't know how to show it. They wanted this, the timing was just bad. And listen, some of that may have been true. That's important. Not everybody who hurt you was secretly heartless. Some people probably did care about you. Some people may have loved you in the only way they knew how. But caring about you and having the capacity to build with you are not the same thing. That distinction is huge. Because somebody can have feelings for you and still be emotionally unavailable. They can miss you and still not be ready. They can think you're amazing and still not have the courage to choose the relationship. They can love parts of what you share and still be fundamentally incompatible with what you need. And once you experience somebody who communicates because they want to communicate, who shows effort without being chased, who doesn't make you assemble their feelings from tiny clues, suddenly all those old explanations start losing power. You stop asking, but what did they really feel? And you start asking a much more useful question. What were they actually capable of giving me? That changes everything. Because remember where we started. The moon, confusion, projection, trying to see something clearly while standing in emotional darkness. The Tower is what happens when the light finally hits the structure and you realize some of what you were holding on to was built out of interpretation. You thought mixed signals meant hidden depth. Sometimes they were just mixed signals. You thought waiting proved loyalty. Sometimes you were just waiting. You thought if you earned enough love, eventually somebody would become ready. But readiness was never something you could earn from another person, and that realization may hurt for a second, because it means some of the relationships you spent years trying to understand were not actually puzzles you failed to solve. They were situations you kept trying to turn into something they did not have the capacity to become. And weirdly, that can set you free. Because the past stops being this unresolved question mark. You don't need the perfect explanation anymore. You have contrast. You have evidence. You finally know what it feels like when love has somewhere to go. And there is one more card here. But this last message is not really about who this person is. It's about what you're finally going to be able to say when you look back at everyone who came before them. And the final card is the Three of Wands. And I love this here because the Three of Wands is about finally being able to look forward without constantly checking behind you. That's the difference. Because for a long time, some of you were technically moving on. But emotionally, part of you was still looking back, still wondering whether that person would eventually understand what they lost, still wondering whether they would come back different, still asking yourself, what if I had said this differently? What if I had waited longer? What if I gave up too soon? And this connection changes that. Not because it erases what happened. It doesn't. But because now you have something you didn't have back then. A frame of reference. You know what consistency feels like. You know what it feels like when somebody wants to talk to you and actually talks to you. You know what it feels like to have a disagreement without immediately wondering whether the relationship is over. You know what it feels like to be wanted without performing. And suddenly you can look back at those old relationships and say, oh, okay. Not they were terrible. Not even, none of it was real. Just, I understand why I couldn't build forever there. Because now you know what forever would actually require. Communication, reciprocity, emotional availability. Two people participating. Not one person carrying the connection while the other person keeps deciding whether they want to be there. And remember how this reading started with the moon? Everything was unclear. You were filling in blanks, decoding behavior, trying to turn uncertainty into an answer. And now we end with the Three of Wands. Looking ahead, that is such a different position. You're not standing there asking, what does this mean? You're asking, where can this go? And for some of you, the funny part is that this person may still not arrive looking like some huge dramatic love story. They may already be around you, calm, consistent, almost surprisingly easy to be around. And maybe that's why you didn't recognize it immediately. You were waiting for fireworks that made you nervous. Meanwhile, something much more important was happening. You were becoming yourself around somebody. You were learning that peace can have chemistry too. That boundaries do not kill intimacy. That being chosen does not have to feel like winning a competition. And that may be what finally releases the past. Not revenge, not getting an apology, not watching somebody regret losing you. Just recognition. You finally understand what you were trying to build with people who could not build it with you. And this love, it doesn't make every heartbreak make sense because it magically turns pain into something beautiful. It makes heartbreak make sense because for the first time, you can see exactly what was missing. And once you experience mutual love, you realize how little real love actually requires you to guess.